so as we gathered here today to talk about the urban environmental injustices, it's especially important for us to account for how settler colonial practices have and continue to create displacement and undermine sustainable traditions. And so such negative effects on Indigenous communities are further magnified for those whose identities are subjected to intersecting, marginalizing experiences. And this is happening both here on Turtle Island as well as internationally. So despite the initiatives and acknowledgements being made to begin remedying these consequences, they continue to be present within our communities. And so this requires us to be present for consistent action in following of Indigenous leadership, including conversations about decolonizing our institutions. And so we would like to call for members of the audience today to do research about the territories on which they live and work, as well as to consult resources such as Faizo's Indigenous Ally Toolkit as a starting point for future action in support of Indigenous communities' right to self-government, sovereignty, and self-determination. So in the spirit of starting conversations, we would like to formally introduce ourselves. My name is Melissa Spiritigliosi, and I'm one of the organizers of this event. I've had the privilege of working over the past 6 months alongside my colleagues at the School of Community and Public Affairs, Shannon Franssen, Eleanor Headzone, and Paula Schroeder. Throughout the panels series here at the school, we've been contending with the theme of emancipation, a concept that has and continues to fuel grassroots movements against power inequality. And so we want to think about this concept in the context of changing cities. More concretely, our goal for tonight is for us to all examine how power manifests itself in Montreal's evolving urban landscape. This begs some of the following questions. Who largely holds power to drive these changes? Who profits from them? Who's disproportionately displaced as a result of these changes? And so when we think about growing grass and gravel, the topic of this presentation, one might think about how we can make our cities more green and sustainable, but we also want to think about how to prioritize grassroots efforts in these changes. So thank you all for being here today. It's clear that these questions resonated with a lot of people. If ever you would like to look back on this conversation, CUTV is graciously recording this conversation and it will be posted on their YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to our guests today. We have our moderator, Mieko Terrius. She's a doctoral researcher and public scholar at Concordia University with a background in communications. So drawing from her specialization and expertise in gentrification and urbanism, she'll be facilitating this conversation for us today, bridging both the academic and community perspectives at the table. As far as our panelists, unfortunately, Faiz Abuhani from Brick par Brick is unable to make it. However, we are delighted to be joined by our 3 panelists. We have Jessica Chen from Chinatown Working Group and Jiao Foundation. We have Shannon Franssen from the School of Community and Public Affairs and Pivot Center, as well as Nathan McClintock from l'Institut National de la Recherche Scientifique. So without further ado, please join us in welcoming our panelists. I'll pass the mic along to Mieko now. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you so much for all of you guys being here. Impressive to see this room so packed. I was not expecting that many people. Is it better? Oh, sorry. Okay, first I would like to thank the organizers for this great event and everything. So Eleanor, Janae, Mel, and Paola. Congrats, you guys. For organizing such a great panel, I'm extremely excited to be with you all today. First thing first, I would like for each of our panelists to introduce themselves and their work and what kind of relation they have with gentrification. So let's start probably with you, Jessica.
Jessica Chen. I'm actually an immigrant from Taiwan. I grew up in Taiwan, but I spent most of my adult life in North America. I went to Philadelphia for planning school and started my planning career in Philadelphia. And I actually worked in more food security and horticulture society. That was my first planning job with a recycling office, learning about how to do waste diversion. And then I moved to Vancouver, BC. That's where most of my planning career started. As majority, I worked as a city planner with the city of Vancouver for 15 years with a neighborhood called the Downtown East Side, which is the inner city neighborhood of the city of Vancouver. And I moved to Montreal 10 years ago and started to work in the community housing sector as a private consultant. And just five years ago, 2019, I got involved with Montreal's Chinatown and that is the point of no return. It's very intense community organizing, and we can talk a bit more during the panel today. And now I'm part of the JAP Foundation, which is a nonprofit that works in Montreal's Chinatown to foster cultural heritage through placemaking and community real estate solution. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Hi, Shannon. I'm sorry we couldn't meet in person, so nice to meet you.
Yeah, so I'll take a couple of minutes to introduce myself as well. So my name is Shannon Franssen, and I'm one of the founding members of the Pivot Center for Collective Action. Before founding the center, I worked for many years, for more than a decade, as the coordinator of the Community Development Corporation in St. Henry, which is called Solidarité Saint-Henri. And in St. Henry, we had a lot of issues to deal with around gentrification over the decade that I was there. And that was from 2010 to 2021, and that was really the time for anyone here who lives in St. Henry or has lived in St. Henry. You'll know that that was really a time of extremely accelerated gentrification, and where we saw kind of the disparity between the very, very rich people who were coming into the neighborhood and the people who had lived there for many generations in the neighborhood. The clash in terms of socioeconomic class was very, very intense. And we also saw several projects that were very eco-gentrifying. So we were able to develop collectively with community organizations kind of a definition and a comprehension of eco-gentrification over the years, and also of gentrification more generally itself. So a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about come out of that experience, but also the Pivot Center for Collective Action. One of our first dossiers that we're excited to work on is a national conversation around eco-gentrification and strategies for combating the exclusion and displacement that can be caused through greening initiatives. So I'm super excited to be here and talking about that.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Hey, Nathan.
Hey.
Yeah, I see you. Good to see you too. Please.
Sure. Can you all hear me? I'm Nathan McClintock. I am a settler. I think it's important to situate ourselves in the broader context of settler colonialism. I appreciate the land acknowledgement we just had. I think it's also important to never forget the connections between settler colonialism as well as slavery and its afterlives and the long continuation of struggles against anti-Black racism. These are all very much tied to questions of land, questions of gentrification that we'll be talking about today. So I think it's always important to situate ourselves within that, and I can certainly situate myself as a white male in the many privileges that I've benefited from in that long history of settler colonialism and slavery. I'm an immigrant as well. I moved to Canada about 4 years ago. I'm a nouveau arrivant anglophone, all this working in a French institution here in Montreal, so all this shapes very much my interaction with how I engage with the city. I studied geography, and currently I'm a professor of urban studies excuse me, at l'Institut National de la Recherche Scientifique. I've been there since 2020. Prior to that, I was a professor of urban studies in Portland, Oregon at Portland State University for about 8.5 years. At INRS, I'm also the co-director of the C3V, which is the Collaboratoire Vivre Vision. It's a collaboratory for audio-visual and cartographic storytelling that we just launched. So hopefully you'll be seeing more and more of us in our projects. I'm also an editor of the journal Urban Geography, an academic journal. I've been working on urban agriculture, doing research on urban agriculture and food justice for almost 20 years now. And I always like to say that it was through agriculture that I discovered the city. I really became an urbanist in urban geography through studying urban agriculture. It really became a window through which I started thinking about cities and urbanization more broadly, thinking about gentrification, about social movements, about environmental justice. In addition to working on urban agriculture, I've done some work on waste management, composting, new project on equity and climate adaptation strategies in Quebec, and then I've just started some work on food sovereignty and food governance in the north. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm amazed to see so many people here. It's quite a turnout. Great.
Thank you guys for introducing yourselves. Let's just dive in. I know that gentrification, well, I mean, we all know that gentrification has been the object of like many studies and research so far. It's a quite versatile and polysemous term, so I would like first for us to like try to unpack what gentrification is, what green gentrification is, what environmental justice and justice is as well. So I will start probably with Shannon. How would you define all, I don't know, which, if you're not comfortable starting, like I get that.
Oh, no, totally.
Okay.
So I'm going to borrow the definition of gentrification that the organizations that I had the great pleasure to work with in St. Henry that developed, so it was the Urban Planning Committee of Solidarity St. Henry that developed this definition, and I really like it. So it is, you'll notice that it is a negative definition, so we talk about negative impacts. Because, and that you might think sitting here that there's consensus around gentrification being a negative thing. There really isn't amongst urban planners. So in fact, it's I would say, or I have the impression, not being an urban planner, but that actually gentrification is more of a positive term amongst many urban planning professionals. So I really do like this gentrification. Or this definition of gentrification, which is that gentrification is the displacement or exclusion, social exclusion, economic exclusion of people who are living either low income or in situations of social exclusion in a neighborhood or an area. And gentrification is a process that comes and displaces them or further socially excludes them. So that's how I would define gentrification. Green gentrification, I would define as gentrification happening because of greening initiatives. So environmental interventions that come to like beautify, or maybe it's under the term of climate adaptation, or dealing with heat islands, so sort of green interventions that cause gentrification through all sorts of different processes. It can be through the neighborhood then becoming more desirable and so more expensive, or leading it to be more desirable and so people want to move there, and that leading to the exclusion of people who already live there. Environmental injustice, I would define as let me think about that for a second. I think about environmental injustice as like a process or a reality that happens when people who are already experiencing oppression or exclusion are more negatively impacted by environmental issues than other people. And this is something that it's been nice to hear over the past few years, more and more people talking about climate justice, climate injustice, environmental justice, and this term is becoming more familiar. But I think of it as like a form of injustice that's related to environmental impacts.
Thank you so much. What about you, Nathan?
Yeah, I would echo everything that Shannon just said. This idea of it really being the replacement of a population with a more affluent population, I think, is very much critical and key to a definition of gentrification. And all of us can think about the idea of this influx of a new population, of rising rents, rising property taxes, et cetera, that lead to this displacement. This is something that the urban scholar Peter Marcuse refers to as direct displacement. But there's also what he calls indirect displacement, which is really when you have people losing a sense of place, a sense of belonging to a neighborhood. And it's important to keep this in mind also when thinking about gentrification. When people no longer feel safe or welcome in the community that they live in. They might be hanging out on the street corner chatting, and then all of a sudden people call the police because a drug deal's happening on the corner or something like that. The music's being played too loud. All of a sudden, celebrations become a nuisance. So people are no longer safe or welcome in their neighborhoods. Small businesses maybe losing their clientele. So you have this sort of feedback loop of loss, which then leads to people leaving, which leads to more loss. And so they may not necessarily be being forced out by rising prices, but that loss of a sense of place also can contribute to this process of gentrification. And so to echo Shannon, green gentrification I see is really how greening efforts, whether they're really kind of infrastructure or even policy efforts that are environmental in nature, can be entangled in these processes of gentrification, of making a neighborhood more attractive to higher income residents and into investment. And then environmental justice, I think we can talk about the equitable distribution of environmental benefits and threats, as well as equitable access to the processes that determine these outcomes. So when speaking about justice, scholars often talk about three forms of justice. They talk about distributional justice, where risks and benefits are distributed equitably across populations. There's procedural justice, where we talk about having equitable access to and participation in the processes of governance, policy making, decision making, etc. And then the last, which is perhaps the hardest to wrap, to pinpoint, is recognition justice, which really involves recognition of the varying experiences of different groups, and acknowledging that different groups experience things in different ways. And sociologist David Pello, who is kind of one of the foremost scholars in really creating an academic discipline out of environmental justice, because it really started as a social movement. It's also a theoretical framework, it's an approach to research as well. He, in trying to identify a more sort of critical approach to environmental justice, he's identified 4 pillars that he thinks we really should pay attention to. First is attention to intersectionality, so not just the difference, but how these differences also intersect and are experienced differently across gender, race, ethnic, language, etc. The second, attention to the multiple scales at which injustice and its solutions may unfurl. What may be an example of an improvement or justice at a small scale may actually be an injustice at a larger scale, or vice versa. Focus on state power and how it reinforces and reproduces social inequalities. And then finally, tapping into this idea of recognition justice, recognition of of minoritized, racialized populations who are often treated as dispensable in particular neighborhoods. And so, you really green gentrification, you can kind of look at all these different forms of justice and see, whether it's a question of a green intervention leading to inequitable access to these benefits, people being pushed to neighborhoods that perhaps are less green, that have more environmental threats, etc. So yeah.
Thank you so much. I was taking notes. I'm going to focus on you, Jessica, right now. You've been working on Chinatown. You have an extensive experience also in DC and Philly. Based on your personal experiences and work experiences, what are the ways those kind of concepts have made sense to you and the people you've been working with?
Yeah, I'm really thinking about what Shannon, you just mentioned about this definition of education and whether it's still positive or negative. I think in this room we all agree there are a lot of negative consequences of gentrification. But as a planner, it's been working on this subject on anti-gentrification for a couple of decades now. And I really resonate with the fact that, within the planning as a profession, and that is really still questionable in terms of definition of quote-unquote success, that we still don't know how to define that when we are still going about with the urban planning project in any of the given neighborhood. So for folks who are not very familiar with the downtown east side, that is a historic low-income working class neighborhood in Vancouver. And when the time I was working in Vancouver, talking about kind of living in the 2000s, that's the time I was working in Vancouver just before 2010 Olympics come in. Vancouver's downtown in the 80s and 90s went through a major transformation. It's been often quoted as the Vancouverism. You have this big swath of brownfield and got redeveloped with a lot of high amenity in mind that we're putting into a certain percentage of the land will be reserved for affordable housing. And the rest you build up the condo with a lot of high amenity parks, school, all sorts of different libraries, daycare, for example. So then you get into this green gentrification discussion, it rise up the value of the land value and whether the distribution is actually equally distributed, and even for the social housing that's been put aside for that particular neighborhood, that is a big question mark. And I'm really appreciating over the past 20 years, all this new vocabulary start to become available to folks like us working on the ground. Like back then, I was a planner for downtown East Side, and there's that big, huge move within the city council or in our profession of thinking gentrification. They don't call it gentrification. This is neighborhood improvement, revitalization, whatever you call it. There are different terms for these things, right? Basically to improve the neighborhood, whatever that means, but not for equally for everyone. So for our team working in downtown East Side, it was really quite difficult to really just to define what we are really grappling with. Neighborhood improvement for who? And how do we balance the benefit that is coming out of all this civic investment coming into the neighborhood? So at the time in downtown East Side, we came up with this phrase. I didn't have these, the colleagues were not really all on agreement with us, let alone city council. We call it, what we are doing is revitalization without displacement. And then all that's kind of our mantra for 10 years, and that kind of keep us and all these forces at bay to go on with our anti-gentrification agenda from within the system, which is very difficult. And that kind of get to 2010 is the time when I left, and I think that is the time that mantra is no longer working, and so there's a time you kind of need to pack up your suitcase and move on because the mandate is not suiting what you are working on. So this, I just kind of want to echo a bit that how these kind of definition is very important about whether we are actually all agree on what we are trying to do here at the community level, or all the different actors involved, are we actually trying to work on the same thing? So that is one just kind of really dawned on me, that how I found I appreciate over the years of those vocabularies becoming more available for us. And the other project I can briefly talk about is actually locally in Montreal's Chinatown. So in 2019, I got involved with Montreal's Chinatown. How I got involved is actually I was just part of a gardening group. That's I was working on my own project, and I got a call from long-term community activist who's been working with Montreal's Chinatown, saying, "Hey, you are that planner from Vancouver. We got a problem. We got these two giant holes. We think condos are coming." And then, so that's kind of how I started getting involved with this group called Chinatown Working Group. And at that time, it was a very dire situation. The more I looked into it, I was shocked by how lack of policy protection Chinatown is. And so the developers, land started to change hands, and speculation was going high. Land were being assembled to get ready for tower development. Even the holding company's name, 1000 Saint-Hubert, is already formed. So we know it is happening. And then the zoning wise, coming from BC, I was a bit surprised. Vancouver's Chinatown has been a heritage site since 1970s, after the fight against the highway, destroying Chinatown, etc. It became a heritage site. So there was zoning protection. But here, nothing. So in 2019, that was the whole mobilization. I think a lot of people in the audience probably have heard about, and that's when we started to work on Chinatown mobilizing. And the main strategy, I'm going to stop soon, then we can get into detail. The main tool that we were focusing on is the heritage designation. In media, you might be just saying, oh, it's Chinatown, so it's a heritage site. But the real reason behind it was that through heritage designation, you will be able to bring in a set of a zoning land use policy that focus on the community that's already there. So that means that no matter it's houses or buildings that already current form and height and density that is already existing, the co-op housing that's already in Chinatown, they matter. So the heritage designation is really a more of stopgap tool at the time. In the midst of a very urgent situation, we negotiate with the city to saying we need to bring in a new set of zoning to be able to put a stop on this speculation and make a clear declaration that people and the asset and cultural heritage in that community matters. So in 2021, we got the heritage designation, and the new zoning came in place, and that's kind of why we set up a JAF Foundation and the Chinatown Roundtable afterwards to continue the work. So that's my long-winded way to say these definition and the clear understanding of where of these terms on potential negative impact of gentrification is very important, because even when we were in media, you might feel that the grassroots movement is as if the voices are united, and it's not. Even within the community, there are different ideas. Gentrification might be good. Look at these old buildings. Why do we need this old building? They are all, it's time to just kind of move them out, putting some shiny new building and shiny new people. That might solve all the problems, right? So even that, it's really that different visions, and then to be able to come up with a clear way of articulating why our vision matters and why it works. It's helpful. So that's a bit of thoughts on how these definitions matters for us working on the ground.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and congratulations on the designation. Community organizing and like try to fight against gentrification, and it works, so it's good. It doesn't work all the time, so when it does, we need to like appreciate the victory. I know that Shannon, you have like some like extensive community experience. Would you like to share some of like your experience, like how you've been fighting against gentrification?
Yeah, and I just actually want to also say that there's someone in the room here who I consider an expert in eco-gentrification, which is Pascal Fleury, who was for a long time the coordinator of the Eco-Quartier in the Sud-Ouest. And the Eco-Quartier in the Sud-Ouest is an organization that I think did an amazing job of doing exactly this, like greening without displacement, so revitalization without displacement. So choosing to green around les HLM or social housing, so that those greening initiatives don't benefit private owners, private homeowners, and then increase the value of that housing, and then further increase the economic exclusion in the neighborhood. So just things like that, which sounds really simple, but it was like a real choice for the Eco-Quartier to take some of those orientations and strategic orientations when they could have just chosen to bring in shiny new green space for shiny new people, which that's a great quote. Because that's exactly what gentrification is about, right? Like in my experience of it, it's bringing shiny new buildings and shiny new people, and this solves the problems of having visible property and people who are not as shiny. And from an urban planning perspective, I think there's a lot of desire for revitalization to be pushing out. I'm going to talk about a couple of examples, and it's difficult to do in 2 to 3 minutes, but there's a few things that some of you might have already seen if you live in the Southwest. So one kind of battle that we fought in St. Henry that really allowed us to articulate an analysis around eco-gentrification was the investment in this sort of green alley. So there was this alley in St. Henry. It was this alley called the Saint Pierre. I think it was the Saint Pierre alley, and it was like just a big kind of gross kind of place of asphalt, and but people used it. The people who lived on that street that backed onto the alley used that space. And the current mayor of the Southwest decided with his administration then that he was gonna, on va embellir ça, on va le revitaliser. And so they greened this alley, and they made it into a Unearthing. And has anyone ever heard of the Unearthing Saint-Pierre? So this is a perfect example of an eco-gentrifying project. So basically they invested, they had this like community consultation where the community came out and planned together some things, sort of. And really what they did is make this very shiny new alley. And it's super beautiful. And what happened was that almost immediately people started to get pushed out of that neighborhood. And what was the case on that alley was that there was a whole bunch of low cost private rental units. So they weren't social housing, they weren't cooperatives, there's private rental units, low cost, this is in St. Henry. It was one of the most affordable neighborhoods. It was one of the most affordable parts of the neighborhood. And then actually quite quickly, I was going to say slowly, but it was actually quite quickly when we look back on it, over a period of probably 2 or 3 years, those houses got repossessed, the tenants got kicked out, and now to rent something there is like, probably about $1,500 for a 2-bedroom. And also, there's just not that much rental units left. So they got sold, and now there's owner occupants. So you went from a place where there was like accessible private housing to no accessible private housing. And the community around that alley completely changed. And now if you go there and you sit there, you see a lot of shiny people. And they're not bad people, but they're not the same people who were there before. And as we saw this happening, we're like, okay, we have to really think about the investment, because this is public investment, right? Like, we all pay for that. And we all paid for that so that those owners of those properties could make a ton of money off of the resale of those houses. So what are we choosing to do publicly with our money? In that particular case, it was creating more economic injustice, creating displacement. We're going in exactly the wrong direction. We see a lot of projects like that around, and there are things that we can do when we think about public investment in things like climate adaptation or dealing with heat islands. We need to think about the impacts of that investment for the people who live around. So that's just one example. You can look it up. That was a project that was supported by the Centre Écologie Urbaine of Montreal, which I think it's a good example of why an organization like that should include an equity lens when they start intervening in a neighborhood like St. Henry.
Yeah, the intersectionality, the scale, multiple scales, approach that you talked about, Nathan. I'm gonna go through the issues and tensions that we are facing with green gentrification and gentrification as a whole. Focusing, just asking Shannon and Nathan about this. How can we we've been talking about how environmental green friendly infrastructure in cities were viewed positively, and what kind of power inequalities are implicit to that kind of projects? You touched upon this. So who are the big actors, and what kind of dynamics? We talk about race a little bit. We touch upon civil colonialism as well. Class. Can you just give us some details about this?
Okay.
Sure. Please,
yeah, absolutely. I think the question of who's in the room at any of these events and any of these public consultations is key to the idea. Obviously, we know that developers wield tremendous power when deciding what goes where, the role that they have. Cities are beholden to the tax revenue that's going to come in with new development. Clearly, a block of condos generates a lot more tax revenue than a garden or a park or things like that. So we know that the developers have a lot of power, but even in thinking within kind of community, there is this sort of this differential, and particularly as you have more and more newcomers coming in of this more affluent class, they tend to also have more power in many of these settings. I mean, often there's a certain cultural capital, social capital that they can wield in terms of knowing how the system works, knowing how to have access to policymakers. If it's a group of people who are interested in getting a grant to do a neighborhood improvement, knowing how to write the grant, where the money comes from, having the tech savvy to get funds or to sort of crowdsource it. So I think those things are always important to think about. Who's actually driving some of the projects, who's present. Also, once a certain kind of, once that crowd, I guess, builds up enough, what that can do in terms of excluding others just by simply by the fact that there's a bunch of people who belong to a particular class, perhaps it's a different ethnocultural group, different racial group, when you start having more and more of that particular group, particularly if it's a newcomer group, other people may feel less welcome in those spaces as well. So I think being aware of those types of dynamics is really important. I think also, it's important to recognize too that more affluent people often tend to have more time to volunteer, do things like that. So that, again, that's another thing leading to a sort of extra presence of particular groups of people. Often you have more homeowners who are louder, who wield more power in these discussions, and renters, something that Shannon alluded to. So I think we're just thinking about the participation process itself, and we'll talk more about participation and this kind of process. But just guaranteeing that these processes actually reflect the needs and desires and wishes of the whole population, rather than just those who perhaps show up to these moments, these participatory processes.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much, Nathan. Shannon, do you have anything to add about this?
Yeah, I think with the question of sort of power inequities and who has power right now, especially around this issue of eco-gentrification, I want to actually bring this discussion to the level of the National Climate Adaptation Strategy, which you might think is not related, but in my opinion is incredibly related. So you may know about this or you may not, but Canada has a national climate adaptation policy. It's part of Canada's commitments in the COP process, so in the United Nations convened process around climate diplomacy. Nation states, they say, okay, we're going to do so much around climate mitigation, we're going to do so much around climate adaptation. And so as part of Canada's commitments involves spending a boatload of money on climate adaptation, and a lot of that is going to urban environments. So there's just going to be a ton of cash coming down from the federal government and trickling its way through bureaucracy, the way federal money does, down to initiatives like the Unearthing that I was describing, which wasn't funded by the climate adaptation policy because it was before that, but you get the idea. Municipalities are going to have access to money to do initiatives that are going to be reframed, because this is the world we live in now, going to be reframed as climate action. So this is really, I think, really important for us to be aware of how this idea of climate action could actually lead to climate injustice and to greater environmental injustice in our communities. Because if that money is used to do projects like the Unearthing, where who actually benefits from it are private landowners and the city, who's going to collect more taxes because that land is now worth a lot more because it's beside a very beautiful park. What we're actually creating here is not only displacement and social exclusion, but a situation in which our public money is invested to make rich people richer. This is a dynamic that I think we should be really analyzing and talking about at a national level, because it's not just one park at a time. There is a more coordinated strategy, and there's a way for us to bring our analysis to a bigger level and to start asking cities to, when they are investing money in green initiatives, to make sure those are initiatives that don't displace people, that don't create further social exclusion. And there's great organizations like the Écoquartier, Le Sud-Ouest, that have experience in how to do that. So I said at the beginning that the Pivot Center for Collective Action is going to coordinate a national conversation around this issue. It is for that reason, because this is actually a broader issue around climate justice and inequity.
Thank you so much, Shannon.
A big fan of looking into different forms of community real estate solution. yeah, we will not be able to just leave it to government saying, here is where the density is going to happen. And with the density, we negotiate a community benefit agreement, and that means certain portion of the land lift, the value that come from the land value rise, we take a little portion of that and then spread around to deliver certain type of community benefits for parks and infrastructure, etc. I think that model has a lot of limitation to that because it doesn't deal with the governance and the finance. These are the kind of two very fundamental things. So the only way to really be able to tackle that from a very systemic way is to really build infrastructure at the community level, be it land trust or community organizations to start to do community real estate. We are seeing that in Quebec and BC. Actually, after 1993, that is a time when federal government pulled out of the national housing work. And that BC and Quebec are the only two provinces continue to build social housing, right? So these two provinces do have more interesting ways to look at how we can continue access capital to keep the building of affordable housing going, even though it's not even close to be enough. But that infrastructure is not completely dead compared to the rest of Canada in different provinces. So I think when we get into the talking about anti-gentrification, anti-displacement, really need to start to look at the form of development. Yes, the public space, the green gentrification is a big thing around because it's part of the amenity. But then when it comes to development, I think we need to start to break it down other than just, hey, we want development, we don't want development. No, what is our alternative vision for development? The form of development, the size, the shape. We don't want big block one, if we want a small development because the incremental change is going to be more digestible for the existing community. So the form of development matters. The pace of development matters too. There will always be private house, market housing and some form of social housing. So the pace of these different type of housing, which one happen first? You know, affordable housing always take a lot longer time to get financing together. So where are the regulations to regulate the pace of development for these two different type of development to take place? And then ownership structure of development. So to me, that is kind of where the very interesting next phase of our work in our Chinatown is to start to get into that now. Yeah, we have the new zoning that kind of help us from being completely, prevent us from completely being erased. So now we buy ourselves some time, real estate is moving again. The developers are to sell off the land and now they know, okay, this is where the height they can go. So with that happening, what is the alternative development vision for us? And then that is the part that we hope JA Foundation can start to work with other nonprofits to figure that out. Nobody has full answer yet, but there are different alternative ways to look at how do we access more social impact financing. So other than just government funding, where are the different type of financing can come in to help us deliver these type of projects?
Yeah, you just mentioned the role of like coalition building. It's something that I would like for us to focus on for like the next few minutes. So both you guys, Shannon and Jessica, based on like your own personal and professional experience in the field, what is the importance of coalition building to fight against gentrification and like climate injustice? And what kind of strategies, if any, have you guys put in place that were successful or not? You know what I mean? I think like what something is really missing in like the gentrification discussion most of the time with academics is the lack of proper solutions, hands-on solutions for people who actually suffer the most from gentrification. We talk about it like in a very, you know, like concepts and everything that are extremely useful, as we said, but I think it would be interesting for like the audience to know more about like the strategies that you put in place and how coalition building plays out as well.
Well, I think that Jessica just kind of touched on the core of the solutions. It's like gentrification, insofar as it involves displacement and exclusion through displacement, we can combat that by having community real estate. So community housing infrastructure. So ultimately, any strategy that's about, let's say an anti-gentrification strategy, think involves really pushing for a maximum of community infrastructure, community real estate, community housing. The question of the importance of coalition building, I mean, I'm trying to find a nuanced way to answer this, but I'm not very good at nuance, as the students who have had me as a prof know, really bad at that. But yeah, I mean, I think really if we want to, even if it's something as simple as in a neighborhood, really fighting for social housing, when that happens by a coalition, so by a coalition of community organizations that include organizations that are also doing green gentrification or anti-green gentrification projects that have thought about greening, that have thought about all sorts of aspects of community development, and all of those organizations come together and say, we are all fighting for more social housing. That's very powerful. Because it can be very easy to isolate one voice, like the one housing rights group in your neighborhood can easily be isolated by municipal governments or city councilors. But when it's all the organizations asking for the same thing, that's a lot harder to isolate. So I'm a huge believer in the power of collective action to bring about change or to have influence on decision makers. And I think it's one of the reasons why we need to go as high as the federal level and do that in a coalition that includes people from different cities to say we understand the dynamics around federal, provincial, and municipal investment in community anemones and how that's playing out on the ground. And so we want collectively for there to be different policies at all these levels that prevent that displacement and exclusion. So I think coalition building is really an answer. And I would add to that the benefit of working with organizations that have different experiences is the collective intelligence that we can mobilize, because not any one person is going to have the answer or the solution or the whole story. But when we put our minds together and come up with a solution, an analysis and a solution together, we can be so much more powerful. So I'm excited about working with both of you in the future on this issue.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about our strategy with After Chinatown Working Group. So with Chinatown, also it's such a symbolic neighborhood, like it has so many different functions and different meanings to different people. From the seniors who are still living in the co-op housing inside Chinatown, they tend to be lower income. A lot of female women, older women living in those housing, to people who just visit, and local, regional visitors, international tourists, a tourist destination. So how do you decide? It's obviously, as a small piece of land, it's going to be very contested with a lot of different objectives that can be loaded onto them, right? So, so when we were actually advocating for the heritage, that was the coalition that somehow grouped everybody together, because we all know Chinatown should not be erased to be condo land. And so that's good enough that we hold the coalition together. Now we prevent that from happening. Now next phase, where is Chinatown going to go? What type of development? That is going to test also to a coalition, because then there was in the details about what is the vision, the fine-tune, fine-tune that vision. So for coalition, after we get the designation, we know the new zoning is coming, because Chinatown Working Group is a community grassroots coalition we organized during the pandemic, and it was very intense organizing with a lot of volunteers. Hours, weekly, Thursday morning, 8 o'clock meeting, nonstop for 2.5 years. We took a break from holidays for Christmas, and that's about it. And so it was very intense, and obviously really not sustainable. So all high profile battles, they are memorable, but not sustainable. So after Chinatown Working Group, that we decided, we got the designation, we decided to wrap up the Chinatown Working Group as a collective and set up 2 new nonprofits. One is the Chinatown Roundtable, and the other is JA Foundation, to serve 2 different types of purpose. With Chinatown Roundtable is to recognize that there are a lot of diverse voices and who might want different things, and they should. Chinatown community or Chinese community or Asian community, of course, is not homogeneous. People have different views, just like any other neighborhood. And there needs to be a place that these voices can come together to agree to disagree, and then to talk with the city hall. So you don't have to rely on the old method, city hall just saying, hey, what point do you? You're the mayor of Chinatown. You say here, toilet is going to, the new public toilet is going to put in there. As long as this token person say yes, then we're going to say yes, we got Chinatown community agree. That is the way it used to be. So with the Chinatown Roundtable right now, we're going to try to change that. It's a multi-sectoral board and come up with different voices. Of course, we can imagine that mandate is never easy to put together these different voices together and then be that liaison group with the City of Montreal. And also need to educate in a way City of Montreal that don't use Chinatown Roundtable to be this umbrella group to give you consensus. That's not going to happen. Right? We're going to give you this wide range of voices, and we are going to make the best collective decision we can, but it's not full consensus. It's just very hard on every issue in Chinatown. So that is the Chinatown Roundtable for coalition building, and I think having a platform like that is important. And with JA Foundation, on the other hand, is focusing more on these capacity building and the tools, developing these tools that can be, that we need to develop in order to have more concrete things to be able to fight against gentrification. So that's kind of focusing on very different type of mandate. So then on the coalition building, that's kind of what we did for the next step.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Turning to you, Nathan, now, we've been talking about gentrification and the negative impact of green initiatives, but how can we create more green cities without prompting gentrification? I think it's always the big question. If there's any strategies.
Well, I think we've just touched on several of these with the coalition building. I think those are all very important. I mean, I think the key thing is to just to not think about environmental improvement as somehow siloed. I mean, I think that's where so much of the issues comes from, is treating the environment as somehow separate, as a separate sphere, whether a separate policy sphere, as a separate sphere of analysis, as social issues, right? And so any project really needs to consider housing, as fundamental to thinking through, and any type of green project needs to really think about housing first and foremost, but also business, small business retention. I think Montreal has a pretty robust social housing vis-a-vis many other cities in North America. But I think obviously there's always more that can be done. I was just astounded to read in the New York Times the other day that in Paris, 1/3 of the population lives in public or social housing. It's been a real concerted effort in the city to keep people within the city. It's really taken that effort. And they actually own 20% of the commercial properties, and they determine what types of businesses should rent out these spaces. If there's too much of one type of business, they say, no, we need a boulangerie here, we can't have another, we're not gonna have chains, et cetera. So really kind of thinking through and controlling actually what constitutes that mixed state of both businesses as well as having social housing as well. That extends to job creation, that extends to education, childcare, all these types of social programs that we would never think of in the same sort of at the same table necessarily as thinking about building a park or greening or other things like that. So really trying to do away with these silos, I think, is critical. I think also it's really important to think about framing, and I really like what Shannon said about thinking about the danger of the way that the kind of climate adaptation strategies at this other level, again, going back to this idea of solutions at particular scales can, have impacts that are very different at other scales. But being wary of framing, but also using framing as a means to build more effective coalitions, to think through what resonates with different populations, what doesn't resonate with different populations. in my work on urban agriculture, one of the things that was really interesting was I started out in the Bay Area. I was working in Oakland with a bunch of urban agriculture organizations, and it was very much grounded in a history of food justice, and prior to that, environmental justice, and prior to that, civil rights and racial justice. Long history of the Black Panthers and food programs dating back to the 60s and 70s. So the urban agriculture work was always threaded through with questions of racial justice, food justice, social justice, etc. So when I moved to Portland to take my first job, I was sort of astounded by Portland is very much like Vancouver and being renowned for green planning, sustainability planning. It's a place where people go on special policy wonk tours to see how you plan a green city, etc. And that was very much represented in the urban agriculture movement as well. And it was like 100% about eco this and sustainability that, and not a word about social justice, racial justice, food justice. And I was just sort of shocked, right? And particularly because so much of what was happening in the historically Black part of the city that was gentrifying rapidly. And people raising questions of like, well, we're building these gardens, but we really can't get African Americans in the neighborhood to participate. And there was just like very little analysis of the historical context that were underway, the gentrification that was underway. So I think it really requires studying also the neighborhood itself. Who's at risk, who stands to benefit, who stands to lose, who's ultimately deciding. So I think those are some key pieces, but the framing question I think is a really important one. And also we did a study looking at why people engage in urban agriculture, and we did this study both in Portland and in Vancouver, BC, and what was really striking was that the ideas about greening, sustainability, living a more ecological lifestyle, etc., were very narrowly embraced by people with higher levels of education, more affluent, as well as whiter, less diverse population, right? And so it was a very narrow swath of the population for whom this language of sustainability, of ecological greening, etc., actually resonated. Whereas language around healthy food, health, access to fresh food, this tended to resonate across all population groups. So this is fundamentally important when a city is thinking through how do we try to get more people up to the table, how do we try to engage more people in greening, thinking through the actual framing, what actually resonates is a really important thing to keep in mind, and that's something that actually the city of Portland came to understand, because for a while they had these they're called community watershed something grants, community watershed improvement grants, and they were out there, people could apply for them, but it was always just affluent, well, not even gentrified, but just affluent neighborhoods that applied for these grants. And so all the greening money was going into building bioswales, building gardens, et cetera, in neighborhoods that were already pretty affluent, very white, and they realized ultimately that it was the language that was being used, and they did a complete rebranding of this granting program. They mapped out after looking at maps and realizing, okay, all of the money is just really going into these gentrified or more affluent neighborhoods. How do we reach out to more diversity of the population? And they completely rebranded. They stopped talking about watersheds, even though it was the watershed stewardship program. They stopped talking about watersheds. They stopped using this thing, and they really put the focus on community building safe neighborhoods, healthy neighborhoods, et cetera. And they also went out to these neighborhoods. That's the other big piece. I think we're thinking through these processes of participation, meeting neighborhoods, meeting communities where they are, as opposed to expecting them to come into a meeting that's downtown at City Hall. So I think they actually had some tremendous successes just in that process of reframing. So.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Thank you so much, Nathan. Sorry. Shannon, I know you've been touching upon this as well. Do you have anything to add about this way of mitigating issues with communicating with communities and how?
Yeah, for sure. And the question of how to mitigate gentrification while still working towards environmental justice There's a lot of things I could say about that. I feel like I want to tell this story because it just happened a couple weeks ago, and is sort of an issue right now here in Point St. Charles. I happen to be working with an organization, a youth organization here right now, accompanying this organization, and the staff were saying that the public health center here came with the question of like, hey, do the youth who come here want to mobilize around eco-anxiety? And the staff was like, what? What? Like, what are you actually asking here? Like, do you understand that is absolutely like the last priority that any of the youth who are coming to this organization would ever want to talk about? Like, they want to talk about access to food. They want to talk about gender equality. They want to, like, it's so far from their reality. And I think that was really a telling moment for me. I was like, oh wow, yeah. We tend, when we talk about environmental issues and climate issues, to be in this sort of stratosphere of privileged people, and this speaks directly to what you were saying, Nathan, that are just completely disconnected from the reality of people experiencing like social inequity in all sorts of ways. And I think that around eco-gentrification in particular, but gentrification more globally, like I would like to see us talking more about how the right to housing and food is a climate justice issue. Because if we are gonna build cities of tomorrow that are climate resilient, if we want people who are not the shiny people in the shiny new parks to have access to that city, we are going to have to make sure that we are securing our right to housing and food. So this goes back to what Nathan was saying about, in Paris, there's like, we have seen a city that's able to understand that housing should not all be bought and sold on a private market. It's insane. We are creating a situation where most of us will not have access to housing, and most of us will not have access to housing in a future where housing is bought and sold primarily on a private market like it is in here, and where there's investment going into making cities livable places. Because we are headed towards a future where those livable places are going to be rare. So let's put the pieces together and understand that the right to housing and food is a climate justice issue. And we should be all out on making sure that we have a model where, why not most of the housing being actually community infrastructure that isn't bought and sold on a private market? What about most of the urban agriculture projects being community infrastructure that allows us to have access to affordable food in the cities that we live in? This is a future that we could build together, and we have to start questioning our assumptions about how land is traded and how land is owned. And I would say that is in fact a climate justice issue.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shannon, and Nathan too, for bringing this together, bringing the pieces together, as I said, and having more of an intersectional perspective on things. I think it's key when it comes to any types of gentrification, not just green. I would like for us to take a few minutes now, since we have 20 minutes left to talk about trying to having some perspective in the future, future perspectives of what we can do. So this question goes for all of you guys, but I would like to start with Jessica. What systemic changes need to happen for communities to be more involved in their cities and the changing landscapes? If you have any insights about this.
Yeah, maybe just kind of continuing the thread of thoughts around environmental injustice or environmental justice issue. I think for Chinatown, a lot of racialized community, they experience higher exposure. Generally, they experience higher exposure to pollution or lack of access to fresh water, green space, fresh food, and food security, etc. Right? And there is a reason, because it comes from a historic pattern. The historic pattern of the intersection between racism and city planning, and those are planned. Like if you have been seeing the movie called Big Fight in Little Chinatown, put together by Karen Cho, you will see that from the redlining of all the black neighborhoods in United States to Chinatown, where all the mega civic projects, highways cutting through the neighborhood, some Chinatown don't survive and some are gonna become smaller. So these are kind of the historic patterns that's been happening in those neighborhoods that result into this kind of a historic environmental injustice. So that kind of get to the point that now a lot of the residents, for the seniors or the people living in the single room occupancy hotels in most of these urban neighborhoods still have people still rely on these housing for their housing, or migrant workers their working condition in those neighborhoods. So these are actually persistent from the historic pattern to today's. So right to housing and food security, it's going to have to be part of the climate justice issue, because climate change, in terms of climate change, these are the population, the most vulnerable, and they will get the brunt of it, right? So right now, I think in terms of looking forward, I'm looking at some of the work that South of the Border is doing that are interesting for different Chinatown organizing. They start to really accumulating, assembling data around these public health lens into their organizing. So for example, New York, believe it or not, they are going to build the tallest community jail. It's going to be as tall as the Statue of Liberty in Chinatown. So with that project going ahead, that all the senior housing right next to that site is going to be as a construction zone for 10 years to come. Imagine the pollution. So they actually get lawyered up, and then starting to get the data around the pollution, the health, the index to the residents' health. These are seniors living there, no AC, no. So that's happening in New York's Chinatown. They are kind of getting data on that. Same thing with San Francisco. They are really collecting data around during heat wave and forest fire, and these are the people who don't have options. And then within their housing condition, this is really a hazardous situation, right? And same thing with in Chicago's Chinatown, they are looking at the soil contamination index, given the historic pattern where the neighborhood's gone through a lot of industries, residual pollution still in the soil. So even if we do food security, we start to plant community garden, it's in the dirty soil, so what are we going to do with that? And so they are collecting data big time on this. And so that's kind of something I'm looking forward to really trying to tell the fuller story, have a fuller, different lenses other than ownership, social justice lens, but also public health. And so hopefully these languages will work into the climate issue, so it won't be so siloed in our conversation. So that's some of the stuff I've been kind of getting inspired by some of the strategies I'm seeing on South of the Border.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica. What do you have anything to add, Shannon?
Maybe in terms of the strategies to build on, Jessica, what you're saying. I think that we kind of need to collectively follow the money and hold our politicians to task on how they're spending public money on green infrastructure. And I think it's true at the south of the border, there have been some really interesting initiatives around holding governments to task around how they're spending money and making sure that it goes in the case of money that's put aside for climate adaptation or green infrastructure, that it goes first to securing homes, it goes second to securing access to food, and after that, other things like tree cover or greening. But if we really want to design our cities that are both livable in a climate crisis future and accessible for people who are low income, or who are like excluded for all sorts of reasons, then we have to make sure that that money goes goes to social equity. So food, homes, other things after that. So think about the priorities of people who are going to suffer the most from climate impacts. I would also say, like, this is something I've said in a couple different contexts, but I think around gentrification in particular, in community organizing, we're bad at working with lawyers, but property developers are really good at working with lawyers. Like, they have like armies of lawyers making sure that they can push through their projects. And in my experience, it's often come down to like how well your legal argument can be around like forcing an expropriation or forcing some kind of alternative property development, because right now we kind of do community organizing in a reality where like basically all property is privately owned. There's a lot of legal infrastructure around that, and I think that in the short term we need to make friends with lawyers.
And some of them are actually good people, you know?
Some of them are good people.
Not all of them, but some of them actually know how to work with the law and help us in the end.
Yeah, urban planning lawyers in particular, good, friendly ones. Let's make a list of them.
Yeah, that would be a smart move, actually. Yeah, very good research project. Do you have anything
sure.
to add?
I think the first thing is acknowledging that structural racism exists in Quebec, which hasn't been done yet on an official level. I'm going to make a second dig at the CAC here in a second. I just got tenure, so I can do that now. It's just they can't bite the hand that feeds, but I guess you can when you have tenure. So I guess the other, acknowledging structural racism exists. I mentioned this idea of de-siloing environment and sustainability from social issues. I think there's structural issues in the participation process itself that are really important to address. Really improving outreach through multiple languages, which is again with recent CAC policies very difficult to do, but actually making efforts to not only have meetings in French, but also English, but also in Creole, also in Arabic, in Spanish, in Yiddish. You can't expect meaningful participation if you're insisting that people speak the language that you only speak and that they don't necessarily feel comfortable speaking as well. So I think that's a key piece, is in addition to what I also mentioned about going out to neighborhoods and communities themselves to take the conversation to those neighborhoods. Providing stipends for participants, providing food, providing childcare, just like basic things that are providing stipends for transportation, etc. So just basic kind of things that can help people become involved. One of the other things I just wanted to pick up on was this idea of thinking through questions of green gentrification kind of through a climate justice lens, and I just wanted to mention a project that one of my colleagues at INRS, Sophie Van Nest, has organized. It's funded now by Unearthing, which is the climate change consortium here in Quebec. And it's called Labo Équité Climat, and I'm one of the co-leaders of this project, but it's really looking at equity in adaptation processes across Quebec and many different communities, looking at kind of different adaptation to different types of climate hazards, or different types of hazards related to climate. So whether that's flooding, whether that's questions of water access, questions of food security in the north. But green gentrification is one of the kind of key topics that we're looking at as well, and housing as well. So it's just slowly we're gathering case studies, and stories, etc. Not only looking at what people are facing in terms of climate justice issues, but how the adaptation processes themselves can reinforce some of these inequities or challenge them. So I think it's important, as you were mentioning, to really kind of think through these adaptation approaches in a way, and to kind of keep speak truth to power in terms of making sure that these adaptation strategies are really reflecting social justice questions as well.
Thank you so much, Nathan. I'm shocked to discover that systemic racism is still happening in Quebec. I know, right? Like, oh my God. Yeah, I'm a light of words, really. So last but not least, now that we've been talking about like initiatives and like what communities can do, last question for all of you guys. What would you recommend to people in this room who might want to learn more about some of the subjects that we touched upon today, where they can get involved, what actions can they take, like right now, like starting tomorrow? Jessica?
I think be a volunteer, it's so rewarding, and so and join the committee of issues that are really burning for you and be part of the action, right? That you study but then you just kind of need to be part of the action and yeah. So that's what I think in terms of involvement. I think it really depends on the neighborhood, and I think a lot of neighborhood, there are no shortage of issues. So of course I would say become a friend of JAF Foundation. But then but I think I just take it and make sure you'll be part of all the action on the ground.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Shannon, you have like
I would say, if you live in Quebec, and probably all of you do, I imagine, and probably all of you live in Montreal, you live in a neighborhood where there's a housing rights committee, so it's a comité logement, and probably that comité logement is fighting gentrification in your neighborhood, because basically all the core neighborhoods in Montreal are dealing with this issue. You also live in a neighborhood where there's an eco-quartier, so there's an organization whose mandate is to do things like support green alleys and things like that. Both of these organizations have boards of directors and have members, and you can become a member of both of them and start talking about the issue of green gentrification and gentrification in general, and how the access to housing is a climate justice issue. You could do that tomorrow morning by looking up both of those organizations in your neighborhood.
Thank you so much, Anne. And last but not least,
I'm gonna play the academic here, and just in addition to joining up with organizations, I think it's just really important to learn about the neighborhood you live in and the city you live in, and really to do the homework to really learn about where you live. So in this neighborhood, there's this fantastic new book written by Concordia professor Stephen Hyde, Deindustrializing Montreal, all about the history of Little Burgundy and Maréchal. Daniel Rook's book, The Laws of the Land, about Ganawagi. Sean Mills' excellent books, The Empire Within, Place in the Sun's about the Haitian diaspora and the making of modern Quebec. The new book by Ted Rutland and Maxime Aurélien, Out to Defend Ourselves, about the first Haitian street gang. And so I think all of these books are great. There's this amazing series that you can watch on Faiz Abuhani called Afro Canada. There's the CBC series, The Porter, which is all about this neighborhood in a fictionalized sense. But these all provide context and help us understand the ways that settler colonialism and racial capitalism have shaped, but also continue to shape Montreal and Quebec. So I think just doing some of that kind of background reading is always a good thing. And then you can take that with you when you're working with different organizations. And I just also want to put a plug out for the new report that the INSPQ, the Institut National de la Santé Publique du Québec, published, which is about urban greening and gentrification. It's kind of like a policy, kind of how-to guide. That's actually, it really speaks to the excellent work that they've been doing and trying to bring this out and actually approach gentrification sort of from a public health perspective. So especially if you're involved with policymakers, it's a really good resource.
thank you guys so much for this great conversation.